This podcast is sponsored by KidyPulse.
Okay, so you know that feeling when like the school year starts up again or the weather changes and suddenly it feels like every other kid is coming down with something.
Oh, yeah.
So today we are going to take a deep dive into all of your sources and really get into the nitty-gritty of how to give your kids' immune system like a natural boost.
Right. And it's actually pretty interesting going through all the material you've sent because the underlying idea really seems to be that a child's immunity, it's not like you can just flip a switch and it's on.
Right.
It really is something that develops and strengthens as they get older through exposure to different things.
Right.
So our goal in this deep dive, I guess, is sort of pull out the most actionable and I guess the important insights from what you've sent so that you as a listener can actually take this information and use it to support your child's immune system.
Exactly. And the cool thing is that your sources cover a whole bunch of different methods.
Yeah.
Like everything from, what they're eating to how well they're sleeping to how active they are and even all that stuff about gut health.
Absolutely.
Which we hear so much about these days.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
So let's start with, probably the most basic thing, which is diet. What is it that your sources are saying about how diet can influence a kid's immunity?
Well, the number one thing across all the material is that a balanced diet really is the foundation of a strong immune system.
Okay.
I like to think of it as, it's providing all the essential building blocks for their body's natural defenses.
That makes sense.
One of your sources uses this great analogy of a colorful plate.
Oh, I like that.
Which I think is a great way to think about it,
right.
Making sure that they're getting a variety of different vitamins and antioxidants.
Yeah, so it's not just about looking pretty. It's actually about those different macronutrients and things. Your sources actually break down why those carbs and proteins and fats really matter when we're talking about their immunity. So we know carbs give them energy, and anybody with kids knows kids have endless energy. But then we also know that proteins are important, and your sources specifically talk about lean protein like chicken and fish and beans. Why are those important for immunity?
Well, they're crucial for growth and repairing tissues, but they're also really important in the production of antibodies.
Got it.
Which, as we know, those are the things that fight off infections.
Okay.
And then we have healthy fats, things like avocados and nuts and oily fish, which we've talked about a little bit. They help their bodies absorb vitamins, but they're also really important for brain development, which, of course, at that age, their brains are developing so rapidly.
Right.
And then fiber as well, which we find in fruit and vegetables and whole grains and legumes.
Yeah.
Does so much more than just kind of keep things moving, if you know what I mean.
Keep them regular.
Yeah.
Right.
Really important for their gut health, which, as we'll talk about later, has a huge impact on immunity as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because your sources also talk about the other side of the coin.
Yes.
Which is how all that processed food that tends to be high in, the bad fats and sugar and salt can actually end up making their immune system weaker.
Exactly. And not only that, it can disrupt the balance of good bacteria in their gut.
So there's this direct link between not getting the right nutrients and having kind of a weaker immune response.
It's really fascinating when you look at the research. It's not just a vague idea. When a child's body isn't getting those essential vitamins and minerals, their immune system really can't function at its best.
Right.
Which means they're more susceptible to getting sick in the first place, and then it takes them longer to bounce back when they do.
And I guess that also kind of underscores the importance of thinking long term. The habits that we help them build now are going to have a lasting impact on their immune systems as they get older.
Absolutely.
So for those of us who are listening, what are some good examples of specific foods that we should try to include in our kids' meals that will help boost their immunity?
Your sources give some great examples, actually.
Okay, good.
For grains, you want to aim for whole grains like whole wheat bread, oatmeal, brown rice, and quinoa.
Okay.
They provide longer lasting energy and more fiber.
Got it.
And then for dairy, yogurt is a fantastic one, especially the kind with live and active cultures. Really good for gut health.
Yeah.
Along with milk and cheese.
Okay.
And then when it comes to protein, we're talking about lean sources like chicken, fish, especially oily fish like salmon, beans, lentils, eggs, all great choices.
So you're saying I shouldn't just be giving them, hot dogs every day?
Well, maybe not every day.
Got it.
Variety is key.
Okay.
And then vegetables aim for a rainbow. Broccoli, spinach, carrots, bell peppers, sweet potatoes. They all offer different nutrients that are important for immunity.
That makes sense.
And of course, don't forget fruit. Berries are fantastic strawberries. Blueberries packed with antioxidants, and then citrus fruits like oranges and kiwi, famous for their vitamin C.
Okay, so let's actually talk about some of
Right.
those vitamins and minerals because I know your sources highlight a few that are particularly important for immunity.
Right.
So let's start with vitamin C.
Okay, so vitamin C is definitely a superstar when it comes to immunity.
Okay.
Your materials explain that it acts as a powerful antioxidant,
Mm.
protecting their cells from damage. And it also supports the production of white blood cells, which are like the frontline soldiers of the immune system.
So how much should they be getting? How does that work?
Well, the recommended daily intake really depends on their age. But for younger children, it starts at around 40 to 50 milligrams. And then as they get older and become teenagers, it increases to 75 milligrams for boys and 65 milligrams for girls.
And are there any kind of upper limits we should be aware of?
Yeah, your sources do mention upper limits for safe intake.
Okay.
So it's good to be aware of those.
So it's not just, that more the better. It's actually about hitting that sweet spot.
Right.
Okay, so another one your sources talk about is vitamin D. And I think, most people associate that with healthy bones, but it sounds like it's more than just that.
It's so much more than that.
Yeah.
Vitamin D actually plays a really important role in regulating both their innate immune system, which is that rapid first response system, and the adaptive immune system, which kind of learns and targets specific threats.
Wow.
Your materials even suggest a link between adequate vitamin D levels and protection against respiratory infections,
Oh, wow. Interesting.
which we know are so common in kids.
Yeah, for sure.
So it helps boost the activity of something called natural killer cells and the production of antimicrobial peptides.
So where do they get vitamin D from?
Well, sunlight is a key source, but we have to be careful with sun exposure for kids.
Right, of course.
So dietary sources like fatty fish, egg yolks, and fortified milk and cereals can also help. And of course, during the winter months, or if your child doesn't get a lot of sun exposure, you might want to talk to your doctor about supplementation.
This podcast is sponsored by KidyPulse.com. Okay, so we've talked about vitamin C and vitamin D. Your sources also talk about the importance of zinc. So where does that fit into all of this?
Zinc is another essential trace mineral, and it's vital for the development and function of a whole bunch of different immune cells. It's also important for the production of antibodies and these signaling molecules called cytokines.
Okay.
On top of all of that, it plays a role in wound healing and has antioxidant properties.
So it's like a multitasker.
It really is.
What are some good sources of zinc?
So good food sources of zinc include meat, poultry, seafood, dairy products, nuts, whole grains, and zinc-fortified cereals.
Okay.
And interestingly, your sources mention that the body actually absorbs zinc more effectively from animal-based foods.
Okay, so if your kid is vegetarian or vegan, that's something to be mindful of.
Yeah, definitely something to keep in mind.
So how much zinc should kids be getting?
Well, the recommended daily intake starts pretty small at 2 to 3 milligrams for younger kids, and then increases to about 8 to 11 milligrams for teenagers.
Okay.
And again, your materials do list upper limits, so it's good to be aware of those as well.
Okay, so we've covered vitamin C, vitamin D, and zinc. Is there another one we should talk about?
Yeah, there's one more that your sources highlight, and that's vitamin A. They really emphasize its role in protecting those initial barriers against infection.
Okay.
So vitamin A is really important for maintaining the health of what we call epithelial tissues. These are things like the linings of their respiratory system, their digestive system. Those are really the first line of defense against germs.
That makes sense.
And it's also important for what's called mucosal immunity and the production of antibodies right at those entry points where germs might try to get in.
So where do we find vitamin A?
Well, you can find it in animal sources like dairy and eggs, but you can also find it in those brightly colored plant-based carotenoids.
Oh, like the things that make carrots orange.
Exactly.
Okay, cool.
So things like carrots, sweet potatoes, those are all good sources.
How much vitamin A should kids be getting?
Well, the recommended daily intake varies with age, starting at 400 micrograms RAE for young infants, and increasing to 700 to 900 micrograms RAE for teenagers. And again, there are upper limits to keep in mind, primarily for the preformed vitamin A that's found in animal products and supplements.
So we've talked a lot about food and nutrition, which
Yeah.
makes sense. That's, a huge part of this. But it sounds like your sources are saying it's not just about what they're eating.
Right, it's really about a more holistic approach to supporting their immune system.
So what else is there?
Well, sleep is a big one.
Oh, sleep.
Sure.
How does sleep play into all of this?
Your materials really emphasize how important sleep is for a well-functioning immune system. It turns out that during sleep, their bodies actually release protective substances called cytokines.
Interesting.
And not getting enough sleep can suppress this release, which weakens their immune response.
Uh-oh.
And there's even research indicating that children who don't get enough sleep are actually more susceptible to getting sick.
I mean, that makes sense anecdotally. If I haven't slept well, I feel like I'm more likely to catch a cold.
Yeah.
But I guess it's good to know there's actual research behind that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how much sleep are we talking about here? Because, as kids get older, the amount of sleep they need changes quite a bit.
It does change a lot, and your sources provide some really helpful ranges. For infants, it's about 12 to 16 hours.
Wow. Okay.
For toddlers, it's more like 11 to 14 hours.
Okay.
Preschoolers need 10 to 13 hours, and then as they get into school age, it's about 9 to 11 hours.
Okay.
And then for teenagers, it's 8 to 10 hours.
Okay, so it gradually decreases as they get older.
Exactly.
And I guess it's not just about how many hours they're clocking, but it's also about the quality of their sleep.
That's right. Establishing a consistent sleep routine is really important. Think about consistent bedtimes and wake-up times.
Yeah.
Creating a relaxing bedtime ritual, making sure their bedroom is dark, quiet, and cool, and also limiting screen time before bed.
Right, because all that blue light can interfere with their sleep.
Exactly.
And I think it's also worth mentioning that, your sources talk about how lack of sleep can impact kids in other ways, too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not just making them more susceptible to colds and things, but it can actually affect their learning and behavior.
Right.
And even potentially, lead to weight issues because it messes with their hormones and their appetite.
Yeah, sleep is truly essential for their overall well-being, not just their immune system.
Okay, so we've talked about diet, we've talked about sleep. What else can parents do to support their kids' immunity?
Well, another really important factor is physical activity.
Okay, so getting them moving.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Your sources talk about the power of play and how regular physical activity can have a really positive impact on their immune system.
So how does that work?
Well, for one thing, it improves circulation, which allows those immune cells to move more efficiently throughout the body to find and fight off those invaders.
Okay.
And it can actually help clear bacteria out of their lungs and airways.
Oh, wow.
And there's even evidence that it can lead to positive changes in their antibody and white blood cell levels.
So we're really talking about, good old-fashioned playing outside,
Absolutely.
running around jumping.
Encouraging them to do activities that they enjoy.
Yeah.
Whether it's running, jumping, dancing, biking, swimming, playing sports active play, indoors, whatever gets them moving.
So how much are we talking about? Should they be, running a marathon every day?
No, not quite a marathon.
Okay.
For school-age children, your sources recommend aiming for at least 60 minutes of physical activity each day.
Okay, that's good to know.
And it's worth noting that while very intense or prolonged exercise might temporarily suppress the immune system just a little bit,
Okay.
regular moderate activity is actually beneficial in the long run.
So it's about finding that balance.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about diet, we've talked about sleep, we've talked about exercise. Is there anything else that parents should be thinking about when it comes to supporting their kids' immunity?
Yeah, there's another really important piece of the puzzle, and that's emotional well-being and managing stress.
Okay, stress. I mean, we all know as adults that, stress can really take a toll on us, but I don't often think about, my kids being stressed.
Right. But it's something that could really affect their immune systems as well. Your sources actually highlight this connection between chronic stress and a weakened immune system in children.
Okay.
And when they're experiencing high levels of stress, it can trigger hormonal changes that interfere with their immune response.
Got it.
So it can lead to increased inflammation and a decrease in those circulating immune cells that we've talked about.
So what can parents do? How can we help our kids manage stress?
Well, there are lots of great suggestions in your sources. Things like practicing deep breathing exercises together, encouraging mindfulness and gratitude, spending time outdoors in nature, making sure they have time for fun activities and quality family time.
Those all sound good.
Yeah. And also having predictable routines can provide a sense of security for kids. And just creating an open environment where they feel comfortable talking about their worries and know that they're supported can make a huge difference.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think sometimes we forget that kids have worries too.
They absolutely do.
They're not little adults, but they still experience stress.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered, a whole range of things here, from diet to sleep to exercise to stress management. Is there anything else we should be thinking about?
Yeah. The last thing I want to touch on is hygiene.
Okay, hygiene. I mean, that's probably the most obvious one, right?
Yeah, the one we always hear about, but it really is crucial.
Mm-hmm.
Your sources actually call it hygiene heroes.
I like that.
So good hygiene practices, and especially hand washing, are so important for preventing the spread of infection and supporting their immune systems.
And I think as parents, we all, tell our kids to wash their hands, but are there any like specific tips or things that we should be doing to make sure they're doing it effectively?
Yeah, your sources actually outline those key steps.
Okay, good.
So first, wet their hands, then lather with soap for at least 20 seconds.
20 seconds. Okay.
That's important.
Got it.
Making sure to get all surfaces, rinsing them well, and then drying thoroughly with a clean towel or by air drying.
Okay.
And then they also list some crucial times when hand washing is particularly important,
Okay, like when?
like before they eat,
Okay.
after using the toilet,
Yeah.
after being in public places, after touching animals, after coughing or sneezing.
So basically anytime they might have come into contact with germs.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it's worth noting that while hand sanitizers can be convenient when soap and water aren't available, they might not be as effective,
Oh, really?
especially if their hands are visibly dirty.
Okay.
Hand washing really does physically remove those germs.
Okay, so that's a good reminder, if they've been playing in the mud or something.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of different aspects of supporting a child's immune system, but I know there's one more thing that your sources really focus on, and that's gut health.
Right, gut health is a really fascinating and increasingly important area when it comes to immunity.
Okay, so explain that a little bit more.
So the gut microbiome, which is this incredible community of trillions of bacteria and other microorganisms that live in their digestive tract, plays a surprisingly big role in their immune system.
Okay, I've heard of the gut microbiome, but I don't really understand what it is.
Yeah, it's pretty
Right.
complex, but basically it's this whole ecosystem of bacteria that live in our guts, and they're actually really important for our health.
Okay.
Your sources point out that a large percentage, some even say 70 to 80% of our immune system, actually resides in our gut.
Wow. Okay, I had no idea.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
So how does that work?
Well, when we have a healthy and balanced gut microbiome, it helps our immune system to effectively fight off viruses and manage inflammation.
Got it. So the healthier our gut, the healthier our immune system.
Exactly.
Okay, and I know this is where probiotics and prebiotics come in, but I always get those two confused.
Yeah, it can be a bit confusing.
Mm.
So probiotics are the actual beneficial live bacteria
Okay.
that can have all these health benefits. And prebiotics are the non-digestible fibers that act as food for those good gut bacteria.
Okay, so the prebiotics feed the probiotics.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
So good food sources of probiotics include things like yogurt with live and active cultures, kefir fermented foods like sauerkraut and kimchi,
Okay.
and then good sources of prebiotics include bananas, apples, onions, garlic, and whole grains.
So we should be feeding both the good bacteria and feeding the food that feeds the good bacteria.
Exactly.
Got it.
And your sources highlight this really interesting idea that the gut microbiome actually helps to train the developing immune system
Oh, wow.
to distinguish between harmful and harmless substances.
Oh, okay.
And they also talk about how an imbalance in the gut microbiome early in life might actually increase the risk of developing allergies and other immune-related conditions.
Oh, wow. So
Oh.
that's something that starts, really early on.
Yeah, it's fascinating how important that early development is.
Okay, so to sum it all up, it sounds like when we're talking about naturally boosting our kids' immunity, it's really about taking a multi-pronged approach.
Absolutely. It's about creating this supportive environment through a balanced diet that's rich in all those essential nutrients, making sure they're getting enough sleep, encouraging regular and enjoyable physical activity, helping them manage stress effectively,
Okay.
practicing good hygiene, and of course, supporting a healthy gut microbiome.
Yeah.
All these elements work together.
Right. It's like a whole system.
Exactly.
So it's not about doing just one thing. It's about doing all of these things.
It's about creating that synergy
Yeah.
that leads to a stronger and more resilient immune system.
Yeah. And I think as parents, it's easy to get overwhelmed with all of this information. So do you have any advice for, how we can start to implement some of these changes without, making it too overwhelming for ourselves or for our kids?
Yeah, I think it's really important to just take it one step at a time. Don't try to change everything overnight
Okay, good advice.
and involve your children in the process.
Yeah,
Make it a family effort to build those healthy habits.
right.
Make it fun, make it engaging, and it will become more sustainable in the long run.
And I think it's also worth emphasizing that, if you have any specific concerns about your child's health, or you're thinking about making big changes to their diet or starting them on supplements, it's always a good idea to talk to their doctor.
Absolutely.
They can give you personalized advice.
Right. It's about empowering you with knowledge and strategies, but always prioritizing professional medical advice when it's needed.
Okay, well, this has been a really interesting deep dive into naturally boosting kids' immunity.
It has been.
I've definitely learned a lot, and I hope our listeners have too.
Me too.
So as we wrap up, here's a final thought for everyone to consider. Given all this fascinating information about the connection between the gut microbiome and the immune system, what further research or dietary changes might be out there that could have even more potential to support our kids' long-term health and resilience?
That's a great question. And it's a field that's constantly evolving, so there's always more to learn and explore.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me. This podcast is sponsored by KidyPulse.